Okay, Jordan, so today we're going to be going over what a relative clause is and how we can identify it in sentences. So a relative clause tells about a noun, like an adjective, and it usually follows the noun that it tells about. They can occur after a subject noun or an object noun. So in this sentence, the boy who was walking across the street got splashed. Who was walking across the street is the relative clause. The boy got splashed by the car that ran through the puddle. That ran through the puddle is the relative clause in this sentence. And relative clauses usually start with a relative pronoun, that, which, who, whom, and whose. So, now we're going to read some sentences, and I will read a sentence. Then you will read the sentence. After you read, I will talk to you about the sentence's meaning and what the relative clause adds to the information in the sentence. So let's start. The African slave trade, which occurred from 1492 to 1820, transported approximately 10 million Africans to the New World.
The African slave trade, which occurred from 1492 to 1820, transported approximately 10 million Africans to the New World.
Okay, so in the sentence, which occurred from 1492 to 1820, is the relative clause. It tells us when the African slave trade occurred and 10 million Africans were taken to the New World. So now we know that the African slave trade occurred from 1942 to 1820, and that 10 million Africans traveled to the New World during that time. Okay, let's go to the next one. African traders and European merchants sold slaves to American planters who used the slaves on their plantations.
African traders and European merchants sold slaves to American planters who used the slaves on their plantations.
So in this sentence, who used the slaves on their plantations is the relative clause. It tells us what the American planters did with the slaves that they purchased. The slaves were purchased by the American planters, and then the slaves worked on their plantations. Many African rulers who profited from the selling of slaves willingly participated in the slave trade.
Many African rulers who profited from the selling of slaves willingly participated in the slave trade.
Okay, so in this sentence, who profited from the selling of slaves is the relative clause. This tells us that the African rulers made money when selling the Africans to be slaves. This tells us that they were willing to participate because they were making money from selling Africans. Okay. So now we're going to read a passage together at the same time. So on the count of 3, we'll read together.
For slaves, the voyage across the Atlantic, which was known as the Middle Passage, was a harrowing experience. It was the second or middle leg in the triangular trading routes linking Europe, Africa, and America. Men, women, and children who often did not survive the passage were crammed aboard vessels as tightly as possible. Diseases such as measles and smallpox spread rapidly. About 1 slave in 5 perished before reaching the New World where they were sold. Ship captains who wanted to prevent the spread of epidemics were known to throw the sick overboard.
Good. Okay, so now we're going to identify the relative clauses that were in the paragraph that we just read. So next, I'm going to show you the sentences from the paragraph, and we need to find them, or we need to find the relative clauses. So remember that the relative clauses tell about a noun like an adjective, usually follows the noun that it tells about, can occur after a subject noun or an object noun, and usually start with that, which, who, whom, or whose, which are relative pronouns. So let's look at the first one.
For slaves, the voyage across the Atlantic, which was known as the Middle Passage, was a harrowing experience.
So what is the relative clause in the sentence?
Was a harrowing experience.
Okay. Close. Remember, let's look back at our relative pronouns that can kind of signal when we might see a relative clause. We have that, which, who, whom, or whose. Okay, let's go back to the sentence.
Which was known as the Middle Passage.
Good. Let's do the next one.
Men, women, and children who often did not survive the passage were crammed aboard vessels as tightly as possible.
Where's the relative clause?
Did not survive.
Okay, so let's look back at our relative pronouns again. That, which, who, whom, and whose. And let's look back at the sentence and see if we can find any of those words in it.
Who often did not survive.
Good. Who often did not survive is the relative clause in that sentence.
Where they were sold.
Good. Where they were sold is the relative clause.
Ship captains who wanted to prevent the spread of epidemics were known to throw the sick overboard. To throw the sick overboard.
Okay, let's look back at our relative clause conjunctions, or our relative pronouns.
That, which, who, whom, whose.
Good. Okay, let's look back at the sentence and see if you see any of those words in the sentence.
Who wanted to prevent the spread of epidemics.
Good. So, now we need to practice using relative clauses in our own sentences. So to practice, I'm going to show you two sentences, and you need to combine these sentences into one sentence that uses a relative clause. So I'll go first. Okay, almost 10 million Africans were sold during the African slave trade. The African slave trade refers to a three-way triangular trade. Almost 10 million Africans were sold during the African slave trade, which refers to a three-way triangular trade. And then you will do these next two.
The African slaves often got sick on the ships. The slaves frequently died during the trip to the New World. The African slaves who frequently died during the trip to the New World often got sick on the ships.
Good.
The African slaves came to the New World through the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage included Europe, Africa, and America. The African slaves came to the New World through the Middle Passage that included Europe, Africa, and America.
Okay. So we have two more activities that we're going to do today. The next one, I'm going to read a short passage with you, and then I'm going to show you the same passage, but some of it will be missing. I need you to finish those sentences with the same information using a relative clause. So let's start now. Africans traveled the Middle Passage, that was a triangular passage to the New World. Once in the Americas, the Africans were sold to landowners who worked them on their plantations. Many slaves became sick on the ships, which were crowded with men, women, and children. Okay.
Africans traveled the Middle Passage that connected to the New World. Once in the Americas, the Africans were sold to landowners who made them work on their plantations. Many slaves became sick on the ships, which were crowded with people.
Okay, so now it's time for us to see what you've learned. I want you to write a summary of the information that you've learned about the African slave trade and the Middle Passage. Your summary needs to be 3 sentences, and you need to have 2 relative clauses. Here's your reminder of what a relative clause is, and here is your list of relative pronouns that start a relative clause. look over it. Men, women, and children who were slaves were brought across the Atlantic Ocean on ships. This was known as the Middle Passage. Sometimes the slaves did not survive the passage that they were forced on, since people often got sick. Okay, so you did have two relative clauses right here, who were slaves, which describes the children, or which describes the men, women, and children, and that they were forced on in the third sentence. That they were forced on refers and describes the passage that they were on, or the ship. Okay, good job.